Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we are strapping in for what is arguably the most demanding, but also one of the most revolutionary texts in the history of philosophy.
Immanuel Kant's critique of pure reason.
Exactly. And this is not light reading, I think it's fair to say.
Yeah.
Even for people who do this for a living.
It's a monumental task, absolutely. And I think our mission today has to be very specific. We're trying to bypass some of the notorious difficulty of the text itself.
To get to the core.
To extract its architectural structure and its really profound world-changing insights. What we're looking at is Kant's incredibly ambitious project to finally put metaphysics on what he called the secure path of a science.
A path it had, in his view, completely failed to find for centuries.
Just wandering in the dark.
So before we get into the ideas, we really have to spend a moment on the sources themselves, because with Kant, the translation and the presentation are half the battle. We're drawing heavily on the work of Norman Kemp-Smith.
And you really can't overstate his importance here. Kemp-Smith's commitment to this text is, it's almost mythological.
Why is that? Just because of the difficulty of the original?
Precisely because of the sheer density and, frankly, the awkwardness of Kant's original German. His style is famously cumbersome, even for native German speakers.
Right.
So you have Smith, who starts his rough translation as early as, I think, 1913, but the revised, truly influential edition, the one that basically set the terms for Anglo-American Kant scholarship, that wasn't published until 1927.
Wow, so that's decades of grappling with one book.
Decades, refining every sentence. It just underscores what a philosophical challenge the critique is. And of course, he was building on the tradition of earlier English translators like Mecklejohn and Max Mueller.
But he was the one who really provided that critical scholarly bridge for the 20th century.
He really was. And that brings us to something crucial we have to talk about. The two editions.
The A and B editions.
The first edition, or A, from 1781, and the second edition, B, from 1787, if you pick up a modern copy, you'll see these letters in the margins.
And these aren't just minor corrections, are they?
Not at all. They signal often subtle, but sometimes really radical differences in Kant's argument. Kemp-Smith himself emphasizes that even when Kant replaced passages in the B edition, often to address criticisms, that he sounded too much like an idealist.
So it was sort of backpedaling a bit.
A little bit, yes. But Kemp-Smith says those original A passages are, and this is a quote, indispensable for an adequate understanding of Kant's original and often bolder views.
So to really get Kant, you have to see both versions wrestling with each other.
You have to. Think of the deduction of the categories, which we'll get to. The A version is much more psychological. It's focused on intuition. The B version is more logical, focused on the unity of consciousness. It's a different angle on the same problem.
So the book itself is this complex, engineered system, and if you only look at one edition, you're getting an incomplete blueprint.
That's a perfect way to put it. You're missing part of his struggle to build this new foundation.
Okay, so that sets the stage. Let's dive into that struggle. Why did Kant feel the need to write such a punishingly complex and systematic book in the first place?
It all begins with what he saw as this unique, almost tragic dilemma of human reason.
He calls it the burden of reason.
Yes. Reason, by its very nature, has this peculiar fate. It is perpetually burdened with these fundamental questions: God, freedom, immortality.
The big ones.
The biggest ones. They touch the absolute core of our existence. We're, inherently compelled to ask them.
But, and here's the catch.
The catch is that these very questions transcend the limits of our cognitive powers. Reason is left utterly unable to provide satisfactory, demonstrable answers.
So we're trapped. We have to ask, but we can't answer.
It's a kind of philosophical purgatory, just as you said. And historically, this plays out in the endless circular debates between dogmatism, which is just claiming knowledge without proof, and skepticism, which ends up denying all knowledge.
So Kant needed a benchmark. He needed to compare philosophy to other fields to figure out why it was so stuck.
Exactly. He looked at the success stories. First up, logic.
Right.
He points out that since Aristotle, logic has followed a sure path. It hasn't had to retrace a single fundamental step. That's astonishing stability over millennia.
He calls it a closed and completed body of doctrine.
It is. But here's the critical limitation. Logic is purely formal. It's only about the structure of thought. It abstracts away from all content.
So a valid logical argument is essential, but it doesn't tell you anything new about the actual world, about physics or biology.
Precisely. It gives you consistency, not knowledge of reality. So then he looked at the other big success story, natural science. And this.
Hmm.
This provided the key.
Its success came much later, though.
Much later. It only found its secure path in the modern era after thinkers like Bacon initiated what Kant calls an intellectual revolution.
Okay, so what was this revolution? What was the critical shift in science that metaphysics just completely missed?
It was this recognition that science had to move beyond just passive accidental observations. Before the revolution, scientists were like students just waiting for nature to talk, collecting whatever random bits of data fell their way.
Just hoping to see a pattern.
Right. But after the revolution, reason approached nature not as a passive student, but as an active, appointed judge, as a lawgiver.
I love that analogy. It's not just observing what happens, but actively structuring the whole investigation.
Exactly. Reason has to hold its principles, its conceptual framework, in one hand, and compel nature to answer questions of its own determining. It's like a judge cross-examining a witness.
The judge doesn't just let the witness ramble on.
No. The judge forces the witness to respond to specific, constrained questions based on fixed rules of evidence. In the same way, we force nature to conform to the laws we bring to the table in advance.
So the scientific method became successful because we realized knowledge is a fusion. It requires input from the world, the data, but it also requires organization from the mind.
That is the absolute core insight. And this breakthrough showed Kant exactly why metaphysics had failed so spectacularly.
It had been a merely random groping among mere concepts.
Yes, just trying to build transcendent knowledge using only concepts with no sensory input, and crucially, without understanding that the mind itself structures the very reality we experience. The result was just endless debate, no progress.
So the goal of the critique becomes crystal clear. It's a service to reason, to discover the secure path it can travel.
Even if, and this is a huge if, even if that means abandoning some of those original transcendent aims, like trying to prove God's existence through pure logic, as utterly fruitless.
The only way forward is through a ruthless self-examination, setting boundaries.
And that diagnosis of failure leads directly to the solution. This is the famous centerpiece of the critique. Kant's methodological experiment, the Copernican turn.
Okay, let's unpack this for you listening at home because it's a brilliant analogy. Copernicus, right? He was trying to explain the movements of the planets and stars.
And the old model, the Ptolemaic one, had the Earth at the center.
Right? The observer stationary and everything revolves around us. And it led to these incredibly complex, contradictory models, epicycles on epicycles.
A total mess. So Copernicus tried something audacious. He said, what if we try making the observer on Earth revolve and keep the stars stationary?
And suddenly, the math got much, much simpler. The model worked.
Kant proposes a similar reversal for philosophy, for how our mind relates to objects.
So what was the old assumption in philosophy?
Hitherto, the standard assumption, the one that led metaphysics completely astray, was that all our knowledge must conform to objects.
Meaning, the mind has to passively mold itself to the shape of whatever is out there in the external world, to the thing in itself.
Exactly. But if that's true, if we're just passive recipients of reality, then we're completely stuck. We can't possibly have necessary, universal, what Kant calls a priori knowledge of objects.
Because they exist independently of us. We can only ever report on what we've happened to observe so far.
So Kant flips it. He says, let's try a new hypothesis. What if the object, not the thing in itself, but the object as it appears to us, what if it must conform to the constitution of our mind, to our faculty of intuition and understanding?
Okay, now hold on. That sounds radical.
Yeah.
If the object has to conform to my mind, how do we know we're not just making everything up, creating a fantasy world?
That is the critical distinction he has to make.
Right.
We are not creating the stuff of reality, the raw sensory input, what Kant calls the manifold of appearances. That still comes from outside of us.
The raw data.
The raw data. But the mind provides the structure, the operating system, if you will. If the structure, things like space, time, causality, is what dictates how an object can even appear to us in the first place, then we can know the necessary and universal laws that govern those appearances.
Ah, okay. Let's define a term here that's vital. Apodictic.
Right. Apodictic knowledge is knowledge that is known with absolute necessary certainty, like a mathematical proof. 2 + 2 = 4. Couldn't be otherwise.
And Kant is saying we can have that kind of certainty about the structure of our experience.
We can know those structural laws a priori before any specific experience, precisely because they originate in us. This is the crucial move that finally makes something called synthetic a priori knowledge possible.
And we'll dig into that term in a minute, but it's basically knowledge that is both necessary and genuinely extends what we know about the world.
Exactly. We're no longer trying to know the mysterious thing in itself. We're focused on knowing the structure of our experience of it.
So this is a hypothesis. How does he test it? How does he prove this incredible, radical idea?
He says, let's apply this new method to the very things metaphysics has always tried and failed to grasp. Objects thought solely through reason.
The unconditioned, God, the soul, the universe as a whole.
Precisely. Under the old assumption that our minds conform to objects, trying to think about the unconditioned totality of the world leads to unavoidable logical contradictions. He calls them the antinomies. We'll get into them later, but they're basically sets of two opposite conclusions that can both be proven true.
Which is a philosophical disaster.
A total dead end. But, he says, under the new Copernican assumption that objects as appearances conform to our mind, the contradiction vanishes.
Wow.
The conflict disappears because we realize we were making a fundamental error. We were applying a rule that's only appropriate for concepts, the demand for a complete, total series, to the world of appearances, which can never be completed in our experience.
So the fact that the contradictions disappear is the experimental proof for his hypothesis.
That's the justification. What he calls a mere hypothesis in the preface, he claims will be proven apodeictically, not hypothetically, within the critique itself. The whole argument stands or falls on whether he can prove that space, time, and the categories are the necessary and only structure for any possible experience.
So to build this new foundation, this new house of knowledge, he first needs a very rigorous way of categorizing how we know things.
He does, and he starts with the temporal order. He says, look, all our knowledge begins with experience. An object has to affect our senses to awaken our faculty of knowledge. That's the starting point.
But, and this is the key, just because it begins with experience doesn't mean it all arises from experience.
Exactly. There's a component of knowledge that is gained entirely independently of any particular experience. He calls this pure knowledge. And if it has absolutely no empirical content whatsoever mingled with it, it's absolutely pure.
And for metaphysics to succeed as a science, it has to be built on this pure a priori foundation.
It must be. Which brings us to the famous and absolutely essential AS framework, the distinction between two fundamentally different types of judgments.
Analytic and synthetic.
Let's start with analytical judgments. In these, the predicate, what you're saying about the subject, is already covertly contained in the concept of the subject itself.
Like all bachelors are unmarried.
Perfect example. The concept unmarried is already part of the definition of bachelor. You don't need to go out and survey bachelors to know this is true. The connection is thought through the law of identity.
So these judgments clarify our concepts, but they don't actually extend our knowledge of the world. They're tautological.
Right, they just unpack what's already there. Now, conversely, you have synthetic judgments. Here, the predicate lies completely outside the concept of the subject.
So they add new information.
They add new information, genuinely extending our knowledge. His example is all bodies are heavy. The concept of heaviness or weight is not contained in the mere concept of a body as something that occupies space. You need experience of the world to learn that.
Right, so that's a synthetic a posteriori judgment. Synthetic because it adds information, and a posteriori because it comes after or from experience.
Correct, and most synthetic judgments are like that. But now we come to the absolute core question of the entire critique, the problem he has to solve.
How are judgments possible that are both synthetic, that extend our knowledge, and a priori known with necessity, independent of experience?
That is the million-dollar question. And why is this specific form of knowledge so indispensable?
Because that's what metaphysics needs to be. It can't just be analyzing concepts. That's sterile. It has to extend our knowledge a priori into realms that experience can never reach.
Realms like God and freedom. If this kind of judgment is impossible, then metaphysics as a science, as a body of necessary truths, is completely impossible.
But Kant doesn't just assume it's possible. He's very clever here. He points to fields that are already using it, proving its existence.
He does. And mathematics is his star witness. Take a geometrical proposition like the shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line.
Okay.
That is synthetic. The concept of straightness is not contained in the mere concept of the shortest distance. It's a statement about the nature of space. But it's also known a priori with absolute apodeictic certainty.
You don't learn it by measuring a bunch of lines. You derive it from your pure intuition of space.
Exactly. And he points to the principles of natural science as well. The principle of causality, that every event must have a cause, is a synthetic statement.
The concept of being caused isn't inside the concept of an event.
Not at all. We impose that rule. But we know this law must hold true for all possible experience a priori before we even encounter a specific event. It's a precondition for science.
So the question isn't if synthetic a priori judgments exist. They clearly do in math and physics. The question is, how are they possible?
And the entire critique of pure reason is the long, detailed, systematic answer to that single question. It's about laying out the conditions in the mind that allow us to impose this necessary structure onto the world of appearance.
What's so fascinating is that even if the critique concludes that speculative metaphysics has failed as a science, Kant insists the underlying human drive for it remains.
Yes, he says this metaphysica naturalis, this natural metaphysics, exists as a natural disposition of human reason. We are just built to ask these ultimate questions.
I can't help it.
We can't help it. So the critique can't just dismiss it. It has to understand this impulse completely, map out its power, and determine its exact determinate necessary limits. You can't just ignore the drive. You have to explain why it arises and where it's allowed to operate purely.
Okay, so now we enter the heart of the system. If the Copernican turn is the mission statement, the transcendental logic is the step-by-step execution.
This is where he builds the machine. And the transcendental logic is all about investigating how our pure concepts can relate to objects a priori. It's very different from general logic, which is just about formal consistency. This is about objective truth.
And it begins with the transcendental aesthetic, which deals with our sensibility, our faculty of intuition.
This section is absolutely foundational because here, Kant establishes the two fundamental a priori forms of our sensible intuition, space and time.
And he makes a radical claim about them. Let's take space.
He argues that space is not some property of things in themselves. It's not a giant container that things exist in independent of us, nor is it an empirical concept we abstract from experience.
So it's not out there.
In a sense, no. If you could somehow abstract away all the subjective conditions of your own intuition, space would simply vanish. It is a necessary, subjective, a priori representation that makes external intuition possible in the first place.
It's the lens through which we see the external world.
A pre-installed necessary lens. And because it's pure and a priori, its structure allows for the apodeictic certainty of geometry. That's how geometry can be both synthetic and a priori. It's synthetic because you have to construct figures in intuition, but it's a priori because the intuition itself, space, is a pure pre-given structure of the mind.
Okay, so that's sensibility. The raw data comes in through the lenses of space and time, but it's still just raw data.
A blooming, buzzing confusion, as William James would later say. So now we have to move beyond sensibility to the transcendental analytic, which focuses on the understanding.
The faculty of concepts and rules.
This is where the raw data gets organized into coherent objects and a coherent world. The understanding is the lawgiver of nature.
But again, we have to be precise about what nature means here.
We do. It's not the world of things in themselves. Nature, for Kant, is the synthetic unity of the manifold of appearances according to rules. And this unity only exists because of the unifying activity of apperception.
I think
The ultimate consciousness of the synthesizing, I think. That feeling of I that accompanies all my thoughts and perceptions and holds them together as mine.
and the tools the understanding uses to perform this synthesis, this unification, are the categories.
The pure concepts. And he systematically derives them from the logical functions of judgment. If you look at how we judge things based on quantity, quality, relation, modality, you find the corresponding categories.
So quantity gives us unity, plurality, totality. Relation gives us the really big ones,
Yeah.
substance and causality.
Exactly. These categories are the fundamental rules. Without them, no sensory input could ever become an objective experience for us.
Which brings us to what is probably the single most difficult, but also the most essential argument in the entire book.
The transcendental deduction of the categories.
Right. So what is he deducing here?
It's a legal term, really. He's not asking if we have these categories. We obviously use concepts like causality. He's asking, by what right do we apply them to objects? How can we prove their objective validity?
Because if they're just arbitrary habits of mind, as Hume might suggest, then all our knowledge is just subjective fantasy.
Then we're lost. He has to prove that the categories are the necessary conditions for the very possibility of experience itself.
So how does he do it? In the B deduction, what's the core argument?
The argument centers on that necessary unity of consciousness we just mentioned, the I think. Kant argues that for any sensory input to be recognized as my experience, and for it to be held together as the experience of an object, it must be capable of being unified in a single self-consciousness.
The I think must be able to accompany all my representations.
Or else, as he says, the representations would be nothing to me. They'd just be a chaotic, disconnected stream, 1,000 random musical notes, but no melody.
So the unity of the I is the precondition for having any coherent experience at all.
Yes. And the categories, like causality and substance, are precisely the rules the understanding uses to bring that diverse sensory input into that necessary objective unity. Therefore, the categories aren't just arbitrary tools, they are the a priori conditions for experience. Their objective validity is proven by the necessity of the unity of the I think.
That is a massive argument. It's
Yeah.
breathtaking, really.
Yeah.
But there's still a gap, isn't there?
There is.
The categories like substance are pure intellectual concepts. But appearances, the intuitions of bodies in motion, are sensible. They seem to be completely different in kind. How do you apply one to the other?
This is the second equally brilliant problem that he solves in the chapter on the schematism. It's all about judgment. General logic can't help you here. Knowing the rule is one thing, but knowing when to apply it is what Kant calls motherwit. It's a special talent.
You can't just teach it through rules.
Not in general. But
Yeah.
transcendental logic, because it deals with specific a priori content, must supply a determinate rule for how to apply a pure concept to a sensible appearance. It needs a bridge.
And the only thing that seems to belong to both realms, the pure intellectual and the sensible, is time.
Absolutely. The schema is that bridge. He defines it as the transcendental product of imagination, a pure synthesis determined by a rule of unity. And that rule is a determination of inner sense in general according to conditions of its form, time.
Time is the perfect medium. It's universal and necessary, like the categories, but it's also the pure form of all our inner intuition, so it's sensible.
It's the go-between. Let's make this concrete by looking at a few examples of the schemata.
Please.
Okay, take the category of quantity. Its schema is number. How do we form a number? By successively adding one unit after another in time. Counting is a process that generates time itself.
I see. So the abstract concept of plurality gets translated into the time-based procedure of counting.
Exactly. Or take quality. The category is reality. Its schema is the continuous and uniform production of that reality in time. We think of something like heat, not just as an on-off switch, but as a degree that fills time, that can increase or decrease continuously down to zero.
And the really important ones, relation. What's the schema for substance?
The schema is permanence in time. For us to experience change, something must be perceived as enduring through that change. Substance is the permanent substrate in time that persists while all its accidents, its color, shape, position change. It's the necessary background for us to even determine time empirically.
And for causality.
Its schema is the succession of the manifold according to a rule. It's not just that B happens after A, it's the rule that forces us to perceive this order as necessary and irreversible. The lightning must come before the thunder. That rule-bound succession in time is the schema for causality.
So the schematism isn't adding new content. It's showing how the pure intellectual categories can be translated into sort of time-structured, runnable programs for experience. It ensures the categories only have meaning when applied to objects in time.
That's a fantastic way of putting it. It grounds them in possible experience.
Okay, so if the analytic was about securing legitimate knowledge within the bounds of possible experience.
Then the transcendental dialectic is Kant's sophisticated diagnosis of why human reason inevitably and necessarily seeks to transgress those boundaries, leading to unavoidable yet also understandable illusion.
And the impulse driving this is reason's constant striving for the unconditioned, the absolute totality of conditions.
Right. Our reason is just built that way. When we see a conditioned event, an effect, we logically seek its condition, its cause, and then the condition of that condition, and so on, indefinitely.
We have the final answer, the ultimate cause.
We demand it. And Kant says this search for absolute totality is not an arbitrary fiction. It arises necessarily from the logical structure of reason itself.
The illusion happens when we mistakenly think we can find this unconditioned totality in the world of appearances.
A world which is, by its very nature, always infinitely conditioned. And this mistake gives rise to the three transcendental ideas, the traditional objects of metaphysics that Kant now has to critique.
Number one, the thinking subject, which leads to the paralogisms.
Number two, the sum total of all appearances, the world, which leads to the antinomies.
And number three, the ultimate unity of all objects of thought, God. which leads to the ideal of pure reason.
Let's start with the paralogisms, the errors of rational psychology.
The fundamental mistake here is a fallacy, right? The logical unity of consciousness, that symbol, I think, that has to accompany all my thoughts, is mistaken for actual substantial knowledge of the soul.
Exactly. The proposition, I think, is analytic. The identity of the subject is just implied. But the dogmatic metaphysician makes this huge leap from that purely formal, logical unity to the grand synthetic claim that the I is a simple, enduring spiritual substance.
Kant calls the inference that the soul is simple the Achilles of all dialectical inferences. That's strong language.
It is, because the claim I am a simple substance tells us absolutely nothing about the I as an object of experience. The moment you try to talk about simplicity or permanence outside the conditions of time and space, you're treating the I think as if it were a phenomenal object, which it's not.
You can never encounter the simple in any experience.
Never. And as we just learned in the schematism, the concept of substance only gets objective reality when it's schematized as permanence in time. By yanking it out of those empirical conditions, the proposition becomes empty, arbitrary, and completely indemonstrable, a classic illusion.
So if the paralogisms are about misapplying concepts to the internal self, the antinomies are what happen when reason tries to grasp the external world as a total whole, cosmology.
And here the problem is even more dramatic. These are unavoidable conflicts where reason asserts two contradictory claims, a thesis and an antithesis, and both seem to have equally strong conclusive proofs.
This is a logical civil war. Let's look at the first two.
The first antinomy is about the limits of the world. The thesis says, the world has a beginning in time and is limited in space. The antithesis says, the world is infinite in both time and space, and both sides have seemingly sound arguments.
And the second antinomy is about the parts of matter. The thesis. Matter consists of simple, indivisible parts, or monads. The antithesis. Matter is infinitely divisible. There are no simple parts.
And again, the antinomy arises because if you assume a simple part exists, it must still occupy space. But anything that occupies space must have parts, which is a contradiction. But if you assume infinite divisibility, you can never arrive at a complete whole.
But the most famous, and the one with the highest stakes for humanity, is the third antinomy.
This is the one that deals directly with human freedom.
Right. It pits the thesis, which says there must be a cause through freedom, an unconditioned causality that can spontaneously start a chain of events, against the antithesis, which says everything happens according to natural necessity, an unbroken chain of cause and effect.
And the stakes are enormous. If the antithesis of pure necessity is true, then morality, responsibility, accountability, they're all just illusions. But if the thesis of freedom is true, it seems to break the laws of nature, making natural science impossible.
It looks like an absolute deadlock.
All right.
But Kant's critical solution is just brilliant.
It's the payoff for the whole system. The conflict, he says, vanishes entirely only when we recognize the world as a system of appearances, not things in themselves.
Ah, the crucial move again. Dividing the realms. The two standpoints.
Precisely. If we only consider objects as appearances in the sensible world, then yes, everything is subject to natural necessity and time determination. That's the empirical character of an action. From a scientific point of view, the world is a closed mechanical system.
But the critique preserves the existence of the noumenal realm, the thing in itself. And this gives us the intelligible character.
Yes, the very same action can be seen as completely determined by necessity in its empirical character, as a scientist would observe it in time, while simultaneously being grounded in the intelligible character of the subject, which stands outside the empirical series of conditions and is therefore free.
So freedom and necessity can coexist in the exact same action without contradiction.
As long as you observe the boundary between the sensible world, where necessity reigns, and the intelligible world, which is the ground of freedom, the illusion was trying to apply the category of causality, which only makes sense for appearances, to the thing in itself.
So this systematic limitation of what we can know speculatively isn't just a negative project. It actually serves a profound positive purpose.
That is the ultimate payoff. The entire 600-page struggle is to get to this point. By denying the possibility of speculative, demonstrable knowledge of these transcendent concepts, the critique prevents speculative reason from getting in the way of something more important.
The absolutely necessary practical employment of pure reason. Morality.
The critical project safeguards our moral life. Those old speculative proofs for immortality, the ones based on the soul's supposed simplicity, they're flimsy. They lead to endless, useless debate. We cannot know with logical, communicable certainty that there is a God or a future life.
But, and this is key, logical uncertainty doesn't mean we can't be convicted. It just shifts the basis of that conviction.
Correct. The necessity of postulating freedom, God, and a future life doesn't come from some intellectual proof. It arises from the practical employment of reason, from the undeniable reality of our moral laws and our sense of obligation.
This is what he calls moral certainty.
A subjectively sufficient belief based on a rational, practical interest. It's not logical knowledge, you can't prove it in a lab, but it is a conviction that is absolutely sufficient for the conduct of a moral life.
And this leads to his idea of the ideal of the highest good.
Yes, the idea of a moral world, an intelligible world where things happen according to moral laws. This is a practical idea that ought to influence the sensible world. It connects the moral order, which is grounded in freedom, with the idea of a purposive nature. Without postulating God as the guarantor that happiness will ultimately align with virtue, the moral law itself starts to feel irrational.
And this flips the traditional theological perspective completely on its head.
Completely. We shouldn't think of actions as obligatory because they are God's commands. That would make morality subject to some external arbitrary power.
Instead,
We regard them as divine commands because we recognize the inward obligation to them, an obligation that arises from the moral law established by our own reason. The moral law comes first. The idea of God follows as a necessary postulate to make sense of it all.
so the critique's success is measured not in proving these claims, but in building a philosophical foundation that protects the general human interests, morality and freedom, even if the monopoly of the schools over these truths is lost.
Exactly. The real grounds for belief are the universally accessible moral demands, not the subtle proofs of the metaphysician.
Okay, so having mapped the territory and established the boundaries, Kant then turns to the training required for reason to stay within its proper sphere. He calls this discipline.
It's like mental hygiene, as you said earlier. It's the restraint and training needed to guard reason against extravagance and error whenever it tries to go beyond experience.
He distinguishes it from culture, which is just about acquiring a skill. This is about preventing error.
Yes, because when reason operates in its transcendental employment, using just pure concepts, it has no empirical data and no pure intuition to keep it on track. It's flying blind, and that's when it's most prone to illusion.
This brings us back to that methodological difference between mathematics and philosophy.
Which explains their vastly unequal success. Mathematics is successful because it uses the construction of concepts in intuition. A mathematician dealing with a triangle doesn't just analyze the word, they construct the figure either in their mind or on paper.
This gives them an a priori object to study directly.
And this ability to construct leads directly to axioms, synthetic principles that are immediately certain and require no further proof. We just see that 3 points define a plane.
But philosophy can't do that.
Philosophy works only with discursive concepts, like cause or substance. Its principles, like every event has a cause, are not immediately certain. They can't be constructed in intuition. Therefore, they always require a long, rigorous deduction to prove their legitimacy.
And if philosophy tries to act like math, pretending it has axioms and proceeding dogmatically,
It falls into error every time. Philosophy must avoid the dogmatic procedure. Anytime it wants to add an a priori determination to a concept, it has to provide a deduction of its right to do so. Otherwise, the understanding is just, as he says, open to every fancy.
this is why we have to submit to criticism, which is not the same as skepticism.
Not at all. The skeptic, like Hume, was a benefactor because he woke reason from its dogmatic slumber, especially about causality. But Hume's error was just restricting the understanding without defining its limits. He didn't see that causality was a necessary a priori concept imposed by the mind to make experience possible in the first place.
So criticism goes further. It examines reason itself to determine its determinate and necessary limits.
And since reason is the sole begetter of these transcendent ideas, it has an obligation to account for them, either to validate them or to expose them as dialectical illusion. We don't just dismiss the problems, we show exactly why they are insoluble by speculative means.
This is why he says that the apagogic method, proving something by disproving its opposite, is often invalid in metaphysics.
Especially in the antinomies. Because if both the thesis and the antithesis might be false because they both rest on an impossible concept of the object, then disproving one side doesn't prove the other.
Arguing about whether the world is finite or infinite is flawed from the start.
Because the world as a completed totality is an impossible concept for us. Both sides are false because they're applying a demand for absolute totality to a series of appearances that can never be completed empirically. The solution isn't to pick a side, but to show the question itself is flawed.
We have come through a strenuous journey through the entire systematic framework of the critique of pure reason. The achievement, I think, is incredibly clear. Kant established these rigorous, necessary boundaries for human knowledge.
He showed that we only know objects as they appear to us, shaped by the architecture of our own minds.
And by setting those boundaries, he did two things at once. He safeguarded empirical science by grounding its principles, like causality, in the structure of the understanding itself.
And he protected moral and practical reason by clearing a space for faith and our inward sense of obligation, a space that speculative reason could no longer invade. The loss, as he says, affects only the monopoly of the schools, not the real interests of humanity.
So we know that pure reason inevitably produces these ideas, the perfect soul, the total world, God. And then we know they can't be objects of knowledge for us. They're merely ideas. Does that make them useless? Just intellectual dead ends.
And that raises a final, really provocative thought. We spoke of ideas and ideals, like the ideal of the wise person or the ideal of the highest good. Now, we can't grant objective reality to these ideals. You'll never meet the perfectly wise Stoic sage in experience.
Right.
But they are not mere illusions. They supply reason with an indispensable standard. He calls them a regulative principle.
Meaning they don't describe what is, but they guide what we aim for.
Exactly. They provide reason with a concept of that which is entirely complete in its kind. By providing this perfect standard, these ideals allow us to estimate and measure the degree and the defects of everything incomplete that we encounter in the real world.
So they give us a goal, a direction for our inquiry.
A fixed necessary goal for the systematic unity of all our knowledge and a necessary aspiration for our moral improvement, even if that goal can never be fully reached in this sensible, conditioned world.
So the search for the perfect, even the unreachable perfect, is what gives necessary meaning and direction to our imperfect lives.
That's a beautiful way to summarize it.
Thank you for guiding us through this immense and essential text.
It was my pleasure. This is a text that truly rewards every single deep dive.